Thank you so much, Sheila, for being with me today on the WaveCapital's guest speaker series on relationship building in a team environment. You're my 68th guest. How are you today?
I'm good. Wow, that's impressive. 68. Thanks for having me, Garrett.
Yes, it's wonderful to have you on my speaker series, and I look forward to our conversation. I just want to give a brief background of whom you are for my audience, my listeners and viewers at home. You're the former chief of staff for Vice President Kamala Harris during Biden for President campaign, former chief of staff at the U.S. Department of Education when you worked with Secretary Miguel Cardona, former senior advisor for Biden for president, former chief of staff for Dr. Jill Biden when she was second lady in the White
Yep.
House, former chief of staff for Joe Biden when he was the vice presidential candidate and worked on Obama for America campaign, former executive director of Bono's One campaign, former chief of staff for former Senator Bill Nelson, former chief of staff and legislative director for former Senator Bob Kerrey. So I'm quite a resume, very impressive. Wanted to share that with my audience to give them context as we speak about relationship building. When you think of relationship building, Sheila, in a team environment, what does it mean to you and what has it meant for your professional career?
Yeah. The interesting thing is we were talking before we started, like relationships are so important and can be very long lasting in these professions, especially around politics, campaigns, government, nonprofits. So the relationship piece is very, very important. How you are able to get things done, how are you able to include your team on things? It's really, I would say, 90% relationships and how effective you are as a leader. So if you're a leader and your team feels good about the relationship they have with you, obviously that's very important. But in order to, in almost any environment, to get things done, you're working with people outside your organization and the relationships that you may have established in the past. Like you said, when I worked in the Senate in the late 1990s, those relationships will still come in handy. And if I need to do something with the Senate right now. So it's, there's no substitute for the relationships and you have to invest in them. It can't just be like transactional. I think you need to, spend time with people, get to know them. And, it kind of then veers into how you work with your team and what kind of relationships you want to build there. So my style is generally to, hire people who are extremely competent, but then let them do their jobs, right? So that the relationship there is like a mentor, a leader, but it's not a micromanager. So I think when you get into those kind of pieces of it too, how you both professionally and personally work with your employees, I think makes a huge difference.
Yes, absolutely. I wanted to say also that you're the former president of Tusk Philanthropies. I look forward to hearing more about that as well. But you're spot on about relationships, and everybody has their his or her own unique style. And thank you so much for sharing that because relationships mean everything. I mean, it's the essence of humanity, as I like to always say. And when you think of how you started your career at all these different roles, what stood out to you, what mattered most to you, the mentors, the role models, the experience, the relationships that you were going to forge along the way, and all the above.
Right. It really is all of the above because the mentorship piece ties so directly to relationships. And so people who helped me when I was, the other funny thing is people who helped me when I was first getting started, then it turns out like over time, like their kids are interested in certain things and then you can help mentor them. And so, it can be a multi-generational relationship building too. And I just don't see any way around it. You have to work at it. You have to make sure that you establish relationships, that you invest the time in it. Because there were certain jobs when I first got started in sort of the management role that I was really interested. I was like, I want to make sure that the policy's right. And I want to make sure that the politics are right. And then kind of the team building, some of the personnel stuff felt like, oh, that's something I have to do. But over time, I realized that is actually part of the job. And if you view it that way, that, the maybe quarter of your time that you spend on relationship building, mentoring, coaching, that is an extra, that is the job. And you're not going to be successful as a leader unless you do that. And that shift over time helped me, I think, be better at all of that.
Yes, absolutely. And you've worked in various capacities. I mean, you worked on campaigns, you worked in the White House, you were deputy governor for the state of Illinois. You've worn many hats and carried out a lot of different functions. So, what were your favorites? What were the
Mhm.
ones that you really felt like, wow, this is a natural fit for me? And also, when you have the opportunity to work with President Biden, now former President Biden, but when he was a vice presidential candidate, or Jill Biden when she was second lady, getting to interact with the Obamas and working with Senator Bill Nelson. And my father actually met Bill Nelson a couple of times. I mean, he was for a long time our senator here in Florida, our U.S. senator. So you've had a lot of different people whom you work with who trusted you, who relied on you for your knowledge, your wisdom, your insight, your consultancy, your strategist mindset that they really valued. So would love to hear, and for my listeners and audience at home who are tuning in, it begs the question, what excited you the most?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a good question. And I think sometimes when you start off, when I made the switch from being a lawyer at a big firm into a political campaign and then a Senate office for Bob Kerrey, that was like super exciting because it was also the first time I had worked on presidential campaign and was really involved in travel and, all the excitement around it. So I think sometimes the first time you do something is probably the most exciting, but you maybe get better at it as you go along when you kind of learn the ropes. I mean, one of the things I can probably talk a little bit about a couple examples. So one, when I became Bill Nelson's chief of staff, it was right when he was elected to the US Senate, the end of 2000. And I had been Senator Bob Kerrey's chief of staff as well. But with Bob, I was his fourth chief of staff over the course of his term. So by the time I became chief of staff, a lot of things had already been set in place. And so it was continuing it on, making some tweaks, but it was, it was kind of set. But then I was able to use all the experience and all the stuff that I saw over the, 8 years with Bob, that when I started with Bill, I kind of had some ideas on how to set it up in a way that might be more effective, might work better with my style, might work better with his style. So that was an interesting challenge. And I really, really enjoyed that, just getting to take the years of experience I had with Bob and then be like, okay, let's set it up this way instead, because it'll work better. And I've seen that over the time. So that was really great. The other time I think I made a relatively large shift was when I went to the One campaign with Bono. And I went through a lot of interviews for that position. It was the US executive director. So combination of grass tops, grassroots, campaigning, government. And I went through, quite an interview process. And in one of the interviews at the end, it was a panel interview with probably 7 people and me. The question was, give us an example of something that you came up with a strategy, you implemented it and was successful. So I did, I gave, a couple examples. And then the next question was, okay, now do you have an example like that in the foreign policy, global development space? And I said, I don't, I think what you're looking for is someone who knows how to pull all these pieces together, but you have a great team of policy experts. I'm not the policy expert. I can learn the policy. I'm a fast learner. But at the end of the day, I think what you want is someone who knows how all these things work together to achieve a goal. And I know how to do that. And then I'll layer on the policy expertise. So I thought that was, and they agreed with that concept, but it also taught me at that time that you don't have to stick in the same exact lane, that the skills you develop and the relationships you develop in one sphere can also transfer over. And that's what I found. And so that job allowed me to travel to many countries in sub-Saharan Africa and see programs that were working that the US had invested in, and with amazing results around, HIV prevention from pregnant moms so that their child or the babies wouldn't get it. And so it was, it was really, really interesting. But also I was really happy I had something to bring to solving the problem and help solve the problem based on my skills on the domestic side.
Absolutely. And the fact that you were in a position to travel to different parts of the world, especially for the recognition and trying to eradicate AIDS. And Bono is, an excellent musician, performer, singer, generationally one of the best. And for him to, and you see that with a lot of other professionals who are at the top of their professions in terms of accomplishments and accolades and impact. Someone who has a global impact, but somebody who also is leading a campaign and asking you to be the executive director. And I liked how you frame that. Although, foreign policy experience or someone who shapes policy, that wasn't necessarily your forte at the time. But I
Right.
like from the perspective of relationship building, that's exactly what your position was, being a relationship builder,
Right.
pulling pieces in from different directions and having people work as a team. So you're almost like the glue person.
Yeah, that's right. And then I think I would say one of the other more exciting things just happened this last year when I was working for Vice President Harris on the Biden campaign. And then July 21st, she became top of the ticket and we had a 107-day campaign. while obviously the outcome wasn't what we wanted, the ability to be part of that and be on the road and see the excitement and the crowds and it was like that was all, I've done a lot of campaigns over my career and that was like a whole other level. So that was really interesting, which I think also shows that like, if you are open to different experiences, and I always tell people who ask, on mentoring, like, how'd you plan your career? I'm like, I didn't really plan it, but I think you have to say yes to opportunity. And so, by saying yes to helping the vice president on this election, then she became top of the ticket and it was a whole new and exciting experience that I was going to have some of that, but I wasn't going to have the exact thing. But it's all possible because you don't get stuck into only doing one path or another. You're like, okay, I'm doing this and I enjoy it, but here's something that's come along as an opportunity. And if it interests you, I think you should do it, and not get fixated on how it fits into some other kind of plan in your head.
How much experience, having worked with then vice presidential candidate Joe Biden, who then became vice president and then president, how much of that experience did you draw on working with former Vice President Harris and when she was still vice president last year when you were working on her campaign?
Yeah, because I understood the role pretty clearly of vice president. And then I had been Dr. Biden's chief of staff in the White House for 4 years. So I've been around the whole office of the vice president. Therefore, like when we were balancing campaign activity and her job, like I understood what both were. And that's obviously super helpful.
Yes, and what type of roles as a chief of staff for a second lady at the time, Jill Biden, when she was second lady? What type of roles and responsibilities are typical? Do any moments or experiences stand out where the family at home or just somebody who is listening to this podcast who's never worked at the White House or never worked on with a family like the Bidens or the Obamas, and what type of responsibilities that you really cherished?
One of the things with Dr. Biden is that I was able to do a lot of travel with her, both around the United States and around the world, really. And the thing with Dr. Biden, and I think when you're in the second spouse office, it's going to vary from person to person. She decided to keep teaching. So she is a community college professor. And so she taught the whole time she was second lady. And I think she also did as first lady. She was in the classroom 2 days a week in Northern Virginia, Tuesdays and Thursdays. And then we would be able to do other work on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday and over the weekends. But one of the things I think that was really good about that is that, a lot of her students were first generation students. She was a writing teacher. She always carried a bag with her of like assignments to grade when we were on the road. So I think she had and retained very real experiences with what people were going through. And so that was, a great perspective to have as we were doing our work. But she had several issue areas that she really cared about. Obviously, one was community college. One was like women's health care. And then she did a project with Michelle Obama called Joining Forces, which was like supporting military families, not just the service member, but their families as well. So spousal employment, things like that. And spousal wellness, children's education, if you are part of a military family. So she had a very set, like, here's what I'm going to focus on. And it really helped direct our work because we were like, you get a lot of incoming invitations and you can spend your whole time doing what comes to you. But if you want to try to make a difference, you want to, focus on a few things that you can move the ball. Now, as second lady, you're not a legislator, so you can't introduce bills. You're not the executive, you're not the president, so you can't do executive orders. So it's a bit of an advocacy type of position, where you have the ability to raise the profile of something, to get some coverage on it and stuff. So it's almost like you have to be a little more creative to get the work done than maybe if you had if you were the president or vice president. So I think that was an interesting job. And I think in some ways not that dissimilar to the one campaign, which is like you have to be creative in how you get attention to things. It's not going to just come to you. And so we had really amazing experiences. She also really cared a lot about the role of women around the world. So we were able to do a women focused trip to many regions, including, Africa, Asia, South America. So that through line was really important in all of her work. So it would, that was amazing. And obviously I knew Vice President Biden, then Vice President Biden from working for him on the campaign. So it was nice to have a relationship with both of them in order to further the work.
Yes, absolutely. And how proud were you to see that, having been the chief of staff for Dr. Biden when she was second lady, and then for presidential candidate Biden, for you to see them back in the White House.
Yeah, yeah, no, that was so great. And it was, I think she did a great job as first lady. And then the other thing that was nice is when I joined the 20 campaign in the summer of 2020, it was right as they were selecting the running mate and Vice President Harris was selected. And so I traveled with her. It was COVID, so the travel it took a while to get going, but the last couple months of the campaign, I was able to travel with her, then join the administration at Department of Education because both Dr. Biden and the Vice President were interested in having, a connection to the department, and then to come back and do the campaign again. And it's, what you said about relationships, right? So it's like all the, in some ways it feels sometimes like it's all the same people, just in different roles, but it definitely makes it a lot easier to get your job done.
Helps you navigate through the various channels of working with people in the capacities that you worked
Right,
with them on, because, right, to your point, it's pretty much the same people, but over the years of, this person in this role now, and
right.
that person in that role now,
Yeah,
there was some familiarity, and it was very much of like a family. I mean, talk
yeah,
about the family aspect. I mean, these are your work colleagues, but we're
yeah,
talking about the President of the United States, or the first and second ladies of the United
yeah,
States, and the Vice President of the United States. I mean, the constants of the Obamas and the Bidens, and then to the extension of, you talk about working for Secretary Miguel Cardona at the U.S. Department of Education. So when I look at your career, I love that it was like a natural progression for you, and it's made a lot of wonderful, amazing memories because you are a public servant. And although you are in a position where you're more behind the scenes,
right,
unless if you're a part of a press conference or unless you're getting interviewed, because for the average American family at home, they only see, in the media, or whether the president, vice
and the
president, like, what
immediate
are their messages, but you were the extension of them. And so it's such an important role, and such an integral part of the process of these officials, for them to properly govern, for them to properly legislate, even going back to your career with Senator Nelson and Senator Bob Kerrey, and being an executive director of Bono's One campaign. I mean, whether you're in a legislative, in a legislative capacity, or whether you're in a director's capacity, or whether you are, just being a chief of staff, I mean, your role matters so much. I think that it's really understated because people just don't know how
right,
much goes
right.
into it.
I think people are surprised when the first time, if you're even just talking about an event where Secret Service is involved and they have to go in advance, and I think the first time people witness what it takes to put something on, I think they're always surprised because it's like it doesn't look, and it shouldn't. It's supposed to look effortless, but it is a lot of work behind the scenes. And when you were talking about Secretary Cardona, one of the things is when he came in as secretary, it had been only his third time in Washington, D.C. ever. And so but he came in with such a breadth of education experience as a teacher, a principal, a superintendent. So part of the reason that I was recruited to go there as chief of staff is that I understood Capitol Hill, I understood the White House, and so we were able to work together really effectively. And one of the things I think is like he knew which pieces I had expertise on. And I knew, obviously, like on the policy side, that he was going to have like exactly what we needed to do. And working together, we were able to accomplish a lot. But I think you have to, like back to the relationship question, those relationships have to work. And, you could have two people with the exact same backgrounds as Miguel and I, but at the end of the day, if people aren't open to being like, if like I was like, look, you know the policy better than me, you're in the classroom, I'm not gonna, argue about that. And then he would be like, okay, I understand the Hill strategy here. Like, maybe I don't like this, but I understand that you know what you're saying. But you have to have open and working relationships to make that work. And it's a two-way street. And, the other thing I've told younger people as they're interviewing for positions, whether it's a campaign or a Hill office or anywhere else, it's like so much of the work in these type of offices is based on relationship with the principal or with your boss. So you going into an interview, you have to think about if it's a good fit for you too, because it's not a usual work, experience where like on these jobs, like you're gone on weekends, you have to feel comfortable with it. And sometimes like people would be interested in a job, let's just say in a Senate office. And then when the interview happens with the senator, it just doesn't click. And maybe they're disappointed that they didn't get the job, but it's actually a positive because you don't want to be in a job that requires a close working relationship and not have a good fit. And that it's on both sides of the equation, not just the senator, but also the person that might be coming in.
Of course, and I admire your career and everything that you are saying because it really is very, humbling for, someone like me who only had the opportunity to intern on Capitol Hill. I interned for a U.S. Congressman from North Carolina, Brad Miller, and fellow, University of North Carolina Chapel graduate like me. And, beyond that, I went into, NBC News and then
Yeah,
ESPN. So my career track didn't stay in politics, but I have so much greater appreciation and knowledge and understanding that my time on the Hill, although brief, it really
but
gave me a
yeah,
bird's eye
yeah,
view of what happens on
yeah,
Capitol Hill and how shaping policy or shaping the trajectory of policy, coming together. You hope that Democrats and Republicans can work together and as well as independents and pass key piece of legislation. And you see with, President Biden, I mean, probably, and I mean this in the positive sense, the most consequential
yeah,
presidency in modern history. And we've heard, President Obama say it. We've heard a lot of other, Democrats say it because whether it's the infrastructure bill, whether it's the Inflation Reduction Act,
right,
whether it's the gun safety legislation protecting our communities and keeping them safe, whether it's protecting, military veterans and hoping that, they can get their rights right because of
correct,
those
yeah,
toxic pits
principle,
that
yeah,
where they got a lot of burning
yeah,
and they were exposed to toxic chemicals. It's just I think the Chips and Science Act too, and then having to be able to have a robust bill that will again create manufacturing jobs, allow chips to be made in the U.S. And 16 million jobs were created under the Biden presidency. Yes, you had jobs having to be regained from what
right,
was lost in COVID,
yeah,
but then a significant number that were new jobs created. And I just really feel that because the Biden administration was in between now the first and second Trump
yeah,
administration, my fear, my concern is that people won't appreciate everything that President Biden did because he was a one-term president. But I would say that his one term is one of the
yeah.
most successful in US presidential history for a one-term president because he accomplished so much that other presidents that they don't have the opportunity to accomplish in two terms.
Right. And back to your original concept about relationships, the reason that President Biden in part was so effective is because he had maintained relationships for many, many years with members of Congress and he formed genuine relationships with them so that there was a trust built up over a lot of time. So at the end of the day, he was able to get some of these votes through that maybe somebody else without those relationships wouldn't have been able to. And I think it's, back when I was in the Senate, there was a lot of examples of both sides coming together to work on things. I feel like now, like in terms of the partisan politics, it just doesn't seem to be the case. And one of the things I think you mentioned when I worked at Tusk Philanthropies, I worked on was mobile voting, which was trying to get people to be able to use their phones to vote. And we were pretty successful in trying a few pilots. We had 8 states that tried it, over 15 jurisdictions. Mostly for military and overseas voters, which obviously makes a lot of sense. If you're stationed overseas, if you were able to just get on your phone, get your ballot and vote, you're going to be able to participate. But a lot of a lot of the reasoning is that the primary elections tend to be the most extreme. And therefore, the members of Congress, when they're elected, they are elected by the most extreme people in the parties. And so if you made it easier to vote so that people could just easily vote on their phone during the primary instead of having to, take a day off or go to a different polling place, if you have more inputs into that, then maybe more of the elected officials would feel more responsibility towards a broader group of people and not just the narrow group that elected them. So all of this stuff is connected in some way. And it's a shame where we are right now. And I think, kind of I feel like with the current administration, they just don't want anything to survive that President Biden accomplished. And that's, I don't think in the best interest of the American people.
Yeah, I agree with you that, no matter who's president, there should be a great level of respect for the their predecessors. The dignity of the office, unfortunately and tragically, with President Trump in his second term as well as the first term, the office of the presidency, in my view and your view and many other people's views, is at an all-time low in terms of that dignity that's lost, or that respect that it's lost, what the seat of government represents in the executive branch. It's not a place where it represents every people's viewpoints, whether you're a Democrat or Republican. I feel like with this current administration, a lot of people are being left out. What the executive branch represents when you have President Trump in the Oval Office. I remember when President Biden got elected and he said in his inaugural speech, I'm a Democratic president. And he said this on the campaign trail too. I'm a Democratic president, but I'll be a president for Democrats and Republicans. And that's so important, because I think that with President Trump, he's only the best interests that he has, or that he's putting priorities to, are just the people who vote for him. But on the other hand, when I think about President Biden and his policies, he always made it a clear point. He always clearly stated that his policies actually benefit more red states than blue states. And I feel like with President Trump's policies, they actually are hurting the red states. It's actually hurting the people who supported him. And the one bill, or the big beautiful bill that they're trying to get through Congress, it looks like it's stalled in the Senate. And if you compare it to the first 3-4 months of the Biden administration, you're talking about rapid speed in trying to get bills through Congress, and obviously while at the same time trying to figure out supply chain disruption, trying to figure out the COVID vaccination process to get shots in people's arms. So can you speak to that?
There's a interesting saying that the Vice President Harris has said a couple times, which is, this isn't disruption, this is destruction. And there's a difference, right? You might want to come in and be a disruptor, but the destruction is a whole different element. And right now it feels like we're in an area of just flat out destruction that really hurts people. And not only that, the institutions that you would hope would be able to help, the other branches of government, everyone seems to have ceded their power to Trump. And so it's not working as intended, and so there's no guardrails. There's no guardrails right now. And I think that is a very dangerous place to be. And I think, as to your point, when President Biden came in, he and Vice President Harris tried to work on getting, building consensus, getting legislation through, things that helped everybody. I mean, in the big, beautiful bill that you're talking about, there's like cuts to Medicaid, which provides health care to so many citizens, but there's other impacts of that, which means like rural hospitals that rely on Medicaid funding might have to close. And those are big employers in local communities, in rural communities. And so the impact of that is going to be destructive, maybe to the very people who supported him. And so that's, like you said, opposite of what the Biden-Harris administration did. And I think it's quite concerning.
Right. And I understand the need to make sure that undocumented immigrants are able to be living in this country and have some type of legalized status. But when they're fleeing their oppressed countries and they're trying to find a pathway to citizenship through amnesty and seeking asylum, this whole idea of Democrats are more, sympathetic to undocumented immigrants, and that's why they have sanctuary cities, opposed to Republicans who don't want to have sanctuary cities.
The interesting thing on that topic is, if you recall, you can have border security and an immigration policy that's fair and built on, humanity. So
absolutely,
you can have both. It's not a choice. And I think sometimes there's a thing that, the Democrats don't care about border security. That's not true. As you recall, at the end of last year, there was a bipartisan bill that would have provided additional money for like fentanyl coming into the US, additional meetings, hiring more agents to keep our borders secure. And it was going to pass. And Trump told the Republicans not to vote for it because he wanted to have the issue and he didn't want the problem solved. So that really tells you that like some of this stuff is just theatrics with him. He doesn't actually want things solved. And he talked about, coming in and making sure that people who were, criminals and dangerous would be deported. And I think everyone agrees with that. But it seems like right now they're like actually going to schools and like targeting, children and people who are trying to get healthcare services, people coming into the courts to do what they've been asked to do, to report in, to file their forms around amnesty and make their case, they're following the process and following the laws, and then they're getting grabbed. So like it's totally not making sense to both what he said, but also, policy that would make sense for our country.
And I agree with you. And I was going to say that to your point too, I don't like that it's called sanctuary cities because it implies that the Democrats or the Democratic
Yeah,
Party is wanting to be known for just harboring undocumented immigrants because the Democratic Party has always been seen as the party that values diversity, values people coming to America and living out the American dream. And in all fairness, whether it was President Obama or President Biden, and just going back even to President Reagan, who for conservative in the 80s, he'd be considered most likely a
yeah,
liberal
yeah,
today
yeah.
because the last Republican president to really focus on the immigration issue, where, or if you want to say a legal immigration issue, it was President Reagan who wanted them to find a way to have a pathway to citizenship because he knew that they were paying taxes. He knew that
Yeah,
they were, the
yeah.
majority of them were hardworking, law abiding people who just sought a better life. And I just felt that from what I've seen and read the last 40 years, the Republican Party really has kicked the can down the road. Democrats have put forth
Right.
their ideas. I think it's a mistake for half the country to believe that the Democratic Party is not for secure borders or not
Yeah,
for
I think there's
law and order.
a lot of misinformation in our system right now, and I think we saw that last year on the campaign across a number of issues where people really believe something to be true and it's not. One of the challenges I think for all of us is how do you get accurate information out to people who aren't paying attention to the news or cable or looking at papers? Like how some of this stuff seems to like seep into people's brains, but it's actually, I think, intentional in some ways, some of the misinformation that's out there. I remember last year during the campaign after the hurricanes in North Carolina, there was like two different programs for people. One was an immediate emergency fund so that you could go stay at a hotel and, get out of town until your house was fixed. And then there's another program that allows, for applications to rebuild the home in the longer term survival of the communities. But what happened was, I was like on the campaign trail in an Uber and one of the driver was telling me that you only got $500 to replace your home. Well, that wasn't true. The $500 was a quick, immediate thing so that you could get a hotel room for a couple of nights. And so I was like, where did you hear that? Because that's incorrect. But he couldn't say, he couldn't say where he heard it, just, and those things, once they get out there, really, they set. And so I think we've got to work, I mean, as a party, but also across everybody to figure out how do we stop mis and disinformation, and how do we, I think, almost as consumers, have to demand some sources of real information. Otherwise, it's, to all the points that you made, but from everything, it's just things get out there, and then once they're out there, it's hard to correct them, even if they're 100% wrong.
And it must be difficult for someone like you. I have a journalism background. Communication is everything to me. And you're a lawyer by profession. So, what does your legal mind tell you about the current media landscape? How do you solve it?
Well, I think there's a couple things to keep in mind. One of the things that's interesting is that for people who get their news from mainstream media in the last election, we won those voters. So we can continue to focus to improve mainstream media, and we should, but people who do get their information there generally have enough of, information to make the decision that supports good policy. The issue is, there's so many different social media platforms. There's so many different places where people are getting information. And I think the key to solving it, but I don't have the exact answer on it, is like we've got to figure out ways, and I think the other side has done this more effectively, is to meet people where they are. So if you're a person who's, loves knitting, for example, and you're watching some podcasts on knitting, like that's where you are. So if the person who's the host of the podcast says something, you're just going to be like, okay, that's where I heard that. I feel like the other side is good at getting into those things. Like I think, got into like health and fitness, weightlifting, all of those things, and slid their messaging in. And I think we did not do that effectively. And I think that's something we're going to have to figure out, which is like, how do you get to people where they naturally are instead of focusing everything on your political message.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with that because, we can't solely rely on, I mean, national media, of course, to your point, that you can get to voters a lot quicker if
Yeah.
you figure out, oh, what's, his or her favorite podcast,
Yeah.
or,
Right.
is there a certain voice, that resonates with them? And then how can you find consistent messaging that is linked to that, linked to their interests, linked to their hobbies?
Yeah. Yeah. So it
And
comes naturally to them and they don't have to seek it out particularly.
sure, and that I would imagine takes a certain algorithm, or do we need more podcast hosts?
Yeah. And I think it's not just getting a podcast who is focused on politics.
Sure.
It's a podcast that focuses on people, like you said, people's interests, gardening, sports, whatever, but to have our voices in those forums. And I think, Vice President did a few of them on the campaign. We didn't have that much time, but she did Call Her Daddy. She did Brene Brown, where they were podcasts that a lot of, women, young women, suburban women listen to, not for, but they don't listen to it for politics. So, you have some people who want to listen to the Daily every day. That's fine. I think we're good with those voters. But the people who, the people who aren't really paying attention, but will hear things if it's coming through those sources, I think we just need to do better on figuring out how to do that over the next couple of years.
Of course, and you would know this much better than me, but when it comes to local news and also digital platforms that are tied to local news, you always see, every election cycle, candidates getting in front of a certain network or on a certain podcast, right, in recent election cycles. But how much should be emphasized at the local news level? Because if a presidential candidate is actually sitting in a local news studio.
We traveled into a city to have the local news person there, and I think that's important. I don't think there's as much independent local news stations anymore. A lot of them are syndicated, but
Sure.
so yeah, there's. I would say the overall challenge when you look at all the different platforms of media is how do we get to people and provide them information when they are not seeking out political information?
Right. And how can we make sure that information is already fact checked where they're not having to
Yes.
do the fact checking? Obviously, we want them to take it upon themselves to do their own investigative research and make sure they're comfortable with the
Yeah.
information they're receiving. So, all the better to do your own fact checking. However, I know from a journalistic perspective, having a degree in journalism and
Yeah.
being a podcast host is a form of journalism that I'm getting to,
Yeah.
use every day and interviewing people, professionals like you or your colleague Adrian Elrod, who I
Yeah.
had on as well. I've had Chuck Todd on. I've had the senior policy advisor and former counsel to former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, Arshi Siddiqui. I've had a lot of different people, who have come on with their different ideas and different viewpoints. But at the end of the day, it's always based in fact or
Right.
from firsthand knowledge and experience
Right.
on the job. Nothing is manufactured
Right.
because they're in a position to tell the truth, which matters all the time. I mean, I feel that, and Chuck pointed this out on my podcast when I interviewed him, because everybody remembers when Chuck interviewed Kellyanne Conway and she made the terminology that now is stuck forever in the American vernacular, if you will, or the lexicon, if you will, of alternative facts. And
Right.
when President Trump talks about fake news, those words never would have been spoken if it
Right.
wasn't for a President Trump or a Kellyanne Conway. And it's sad in a sense that half the country bought into those, messages where the other half, didn't. I mean, quite
One of
frankly,
the
that's
things that's
really what it is.
interesting to remember on the past election is that basically one third of people voted for Trump, just under one third voted for us, and one third didn't vote at all. So
Yeah,
when you start to feel like some despair, like, oh my gosh, how did we get to this? And what has happened to all my neighbors and friends? It is useful to remember that two-thirds of the population did not vote for President Trump. And so
right.
I think we need to work on getting those, one third that maybe haven't participated to understand that what the stakes are for them and their families, and then also to make sure our own people understand it. But it's we definitely have some communication challenges ahead, given how fast technology is changing and the rapid spread of mis and disinformation. And someone was saying, you might be able to set, like at some point with AI, your computer to not get things that haven't been fact checked. But often, like sometimes people I'm trying to think of a recent example of where someone told me something and I was like, no, that's actually not true. And it was another Democrat and they wanted it to be true because it was like proves a point that we made. But it's like, it's not true. And so it's, you have to also guard against like what you want to be true based on your own beliefs and what is true. And so if you allowed people to to opt in to only get information that had been fact checked, like, will people want that, or do they want to hear a narrative that agrees with their own? So there's a lot of things that we need to work through to try to fix that problem, but that will be the challenge ahead.
Sure, of course. And are you concerned about what we're seeing now across the country and what started in Los Angeles, where there was, peaceful protesting?
Protests should be peaceful. And I think a lot of times, and I think some of the elected officials in California have said this, that sometimes you have agitators that show up
Sure,
to protest that aren't really there to peacefully protest. And
right,
that's not acceptable to anyone. And we shouldn't
sure.
pretend like it is. And burning cars and doing acts of violence, that's not acceptable. But neither is it acceptable to take, peaceful protests and send in the military against people exercising their First Amendment right. I mean, it just seems such a opposite of what our country was founded on. So I think, again, what we were talking about before, like you can have two things. You can be against people who are violently protesting, but support and really support the cause of the people who are protesting peacefully and understand that like troops shouldn't be used against American citizens.
Right. And the point, to your point too, and the point I was trying to make is that, Governor Newsom, I thought it was a very smart thing to do to speak for the amount of time that he did, nationally televised, to state exactly what President Trump's intentions were and to manufacture a crisis. President Trump wants to deploy the military to make it look like that California is lawless. Are you concerned with the fact that although it's a great thing that there's peaceful protesting now in multiple cities and people speaking out against this administration, are you concerned that President Trump decided to deploy military assets on domestic soil to?
100% concerned, especially in cases where the local, state, and local officials did not need help and they did not ask.
Right,
And they said they had it under control. So that, we started the whole country with states' rights and not having, too strong of a federal government. And
sure.
now it seems just very strange that President Trump is like turning that upside down and wanting to nationalize things that have been working fine at the state and local level. And you used to hear so much about local control from some people, and now it seems like local control is not what they want if it doesn't agree with what they want to do. So it's important for some of that discrepancy to be called out.
Yes, I'm so glad that you explained that because I want my audience at home to
Yeah,
know that there was enough assets, more than enough assets. As
yeah, at
Governor
the
Newsom
local
said,
level.
there was
Yeah,
no unmet need. You had local law enforcement. I
that
mean, for
was it.
President Trump to bypass Governor Newsom, where he can't even deploy his own National Guard if that was necessary, I
Right,
mean, that's
right.
very concerning.
Yeah, very concerning. Very concerning.
And switching topics, in terms of having the opportunity to work with the Obamas and the Bidens, and for Senator Bill Nelson, now former Senator Bill Nelson, former Senator Bob Kerrey, working on behalf of Bono as the executive director, working as president of Tusk Philanthropies. Any memories or any things that you like to share, any advice that was given to you? I mean, whether it was conversations you had with President Obama or conversations you had with, Dr. Jill Biden or, President Joe Biden. I mean, are there any things that you would like to share that really meant a lot to you? A moment you had, whether you were on Air Force One or Air Force Two, or just would love to, or in the White House, would love to just hear, like, what are things that you cherish to this day?
There's really so many, so
Sure.
it's hard to pick, but,
Right.
I feel like when I worked with, Bono and the first time that I went up to Capitol Hill with him, to help make the case, he's so knowledgeable on the issues impacting Sub-Saharan Africa and the work that, the US can do, and I think he talks a lot about, the idea of the United States and how impactful that is around the world. And I worry now that we're losing that a little bit. But I think the first time I heard it from him, he's an Irish citizen, about how much like the American people mean to people around the country, around the world. That was like a moment where you sometimes don't realize the impact and the benefit you can have day to day. So that moment where he clarified that was really something special. And then I just think, both with like most recently with Vice President Harris, Dr. Biden, Joe Biden, President Obama, we had one great trip on Air Force Two, Dr. Biden and I, with President Obama when we were going to Michigan to work on a community college and uplift a community college that had been doing interesting things. And, at one moment I was with President Obama, Dr. Biden, and myself in Air Force One, and someone took a picture. So I have it. And sometimes you're just like pinching yourself, like, how did that happen? Because, my parents were both born in Ireland. So I'm first generation. And I think, how far and how fortunate I have been to be able to be part of all these really amazing experiences, all the way starting with, Senator Kerry, all the way through Vice President Harris. Couldn't really ask for anything more.
Yes, and I know the picture you're exactly talking about. When I was doing my research for this interview, that
Yeah.
picture is online, and I know exactly the picture you're talking about. And it's such a special picture. It's a very candid moment. Do you remember when you look at that picture? Do you remember exactly, or in somewhat of in the ballpark of what you may have been talking about?
We had been doing a lot of travel, Dr. Biden and myself, around the country at community colleges, and what some of them were doing that were really innovative and helpful to the students. And I think that was what, we were talking about what we were going to see in Michigan that we wanted to build on around the country. So it was very special.
Yeah, it's very special. My wife is Italian Irish,
Oh,
and my we have a 2.5-year-old son, so he's
right.
Armenian, Italian, and Irish, and so and I just remember seeing online the warm reception that President Biden got when he visited Ireland. He gave Bono the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Is that
Yeah, he
correct?
did. He did. He did. That was a special moment. I was there for that. And that was great to be, both with President Biden and Bono in the same room. And sometimes all the worlds come together.
Yes, and how proud are you to have an Irish heritage that you could share with President Biden?
Yeah, I'll tell you a funny story. When I was working with President Biden at first on the campaign in 2012, and I hadn't known him that well, other than just like because we were in different Senate offices. I was driving with him from the airport to an event, and I was like, oh, I wonder what should the conversation be, and to break the ice a little bit. And I asked him, I'm like, well, now what town? I said, I'm from, my parents are from Ireland. What town in Ireland are you from? And then he like filled me in on the whole history, and I was like, okay, that was good. We had that in common, and I didn't have to worry about what we were going to discuss. So it was great.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad that it broke the ice, and that it's always special, especially sharing your heritage with the sitting vice president or vice presidential candidate who then became president of the United States. I mean, that's such an amazing, extraordinary moment. Final thoughts about what relationship building in a team environment means to you, with just the minute we have left before we depart from our interview. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, reiterate that there's no shortchanging the importance of relationships, and you really need to invest the time. And if you do it right, you as the leader really benefit from that, because you get people are open with you, they share their ideas, they bring something different than you may have thought of. And then those relationships, I've always had a strategy or a theory that if someone tells me they're leaving an operation, you're always disappointed, right? Because you work so well with a person. But then you start to think, oh, wait, like that's another person in another place that we can all gather to problem solve in the future on something else. And so if you look at it as kind of an extended work family over many, many years and paths, you end up with, a great network to help you through problems. And you may not even have thought that you needed, at the time, but down the road, you'll be like, oh, I'm so glad I know someone at the State Department, or I'm so glad I know somebody in the state of Iowa, because, something's come up now in this current role. And I just think it's 100% worth the investment, both for the professional gain, but also for the personal gain.
Well, thank you. Those were excellent words of wisdom. Really appreciate it. I love the fact that your career is the epitome of relationship building in a team environment, like all my other guests, but this truly was a very special interview. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you
For
for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Yes, really enjoyed it as well, Sheila Nix, for being my 68th guest on the WaveCapital's guest speaker series on relationship building in a team environment. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.